Thank you. I was just listening to the news in my office and heard the report that the United States had gone over $15 trillion in debt. Of course, that's just our short-term debt. It doesn't really include our unfunded liabilities, which some estimate to be $100 trillion. But nevertheless, $15 trillion is the size of our total economy, a condition that would mean certain bankruptcy for almost any business. All of us in these chambers have stood in awe, I guess, looking across the Atlantic at Greece and Italy and some of our European trading partners, and it just seems amazing to us that despite their terrible fiscal condition, the politicians in Greece cannot even cut spending. They talk about cutting it, but the government employees are out in the street demonstrating, and you just have to think, can't they see what's happening? Why do they want to keep spending? It's like there's an addiction. But here we are in the land of the free, the city on the hill for the world as far as the country that sets the example for free markets and free enterprise and have fought wars to keep the rest of the world free. Here we are in a situation where we have to borrow well over $100 billion every month just to keep the lights on in this place, just to keep our country going. And all year long, we've been having these public showdowns about how we need to cut spending. We've threatened government shutdowns over the continuing resolutions and over increasing the debt limit. And you would think by this point we would be cutting spending to some degree. We've established this super committee supposedly to deal with our huge deficits. Yet we're passing spending bills this week, today, that increase spending versus last year. And last year we spent 5% more than the year before. In reality, in some ways, our country is worse off than Europe because we have federal debt, we have state debt, we have municipal debt, we have counties declaring bankruptcy, we have states approaching bankruptcy, yet we continue to spend more now than we did last year. After all of the fuss and fighting and brinksmanship, super committees, we can't seem to cut anything here. In fact, we're increasing spending. And the goal of the super committee is not to cut spending. It's not to cut our debt at all. The goal of the super committee is to reduce the amount we're going to borrow over 10 years. Maybe reduce it from 10 trillion to 8 or 9 trillion. We're not even on the same page with the reality right now. And we've increased spending so dramatically over the last few years. I mean, we've added $4 trillion to our debt since President Obama came into office and passed $1 trillion stimulus. We've passed Obamacare adding $1 trillion of spending. And we're still spending. And instead of talking about cutting, the debate now seems to be is how can we take more from the American people in taxes to feed our addiction? And we focused our guns on those very people who create our jobs and create most of the opportunity in our country, people who are already paying the largest portion of national taxes of any country in the world because we've shifted so much of the tax burden onto the top income earners, and we're blaming them for the wealth gap, when in fact the real blame for the wealth gap comes from the government taking so much out of the private sector, regulating with such a heavy hand, having the highest corporate tax rate or the second highest corporate tax rate in the world. The problem with the middle class is not those who are making too much money. It's a federal government that doesn't understand that the more we spend and borrow, the fewer jobs there are going to be in our country today. Yet that's the big argument here. Instead of cutting spending, we're actually talking about taking more from hard-working American taxpayers and bringing it in here and giving it to the people who've created that $15 trillion in debt. How could anyone make sense of that? It's really pretty amazing, after all the promises we've made to the American people, that we're watching our debt go up like this, passing $15 trillion, and we still can't talk about any substantive cut. Let me give you one example of something that makes so much sense. Over the last 2 decades, we've seen welfare spending increase nearly 300%. There's 77 means-tested welfare programs. And over the last couple of decades, since welfare reform, the spending has increased nearly 300%. Now, that's more than the combined increase of Social Security and Medicare. It's more than the increases in education or in defense. And are we helping people? Not at all. We've got more people in poverty than we ever have. And we're discouraging self-sufficiency while encouraging dependency on government. In the last 4 years alone, we've nearly doubled what we're paying for food stamps, from $40 billion to $80 billion in this year's budget. If all we did was return welfare spending to 2007 levels, we could save almost $2.5 trillion over the next 10 years. That's twice the goal of the Super Committee of Cuts. But are we even thinking about it? Is it even on the table? Absolutely not. Because the one thing I've seen with this place is we're very good at getting bipartisan agreement on increasing spending in areas of need. But you seldom see bipartisan agreement. Would we look at spending? Not even a chance. It's not even on the table with the Super Committee discussions. With Medicaid alone, if we return spending to 2007 levels, we could save more than the goal of the Super Committee of $1.2 trillion. But we're not willing to discuss cuts. I think it's a sad day for America that we're plowing past $15 trillion, pretending to be responsible to the American people, while last week and this week and on and through the rest of the year, we're going to be passing spending bills that spend more than we spent last year. And we're supposedly in a recession. Americans are tightening their belts. Many are out of work. And what we're talking about here is let's continue to spend and take more from hardworking, tax-paying Americans so we can keep our spending addiction going here in Washington. It is utterly irresponsible what we're doing. And the President, all he can do is point at those who he calls millionaires, who are generally the people who are creating the jobs, running the small businesses, and having the most to do with creating the investment that makes our economy grow, and trying to blame them for the problems that we create here in Washington. It's time we keep our promises to the American people. I know it's hard for some in these chambers to cut spending because dependency on government often means a dependable vote for many politicians. But it's time we look at the future and the debt that we're loading on to ourselves, our children, and our grandchildren. This country will not survive the type of policies that we're producing here in Washington today. This Super Committee should look at real cuts in spending. If our Democrat colleagues are not willing to go along with responsible spending caps on programs like welfare, then we need to walk away from the table and take our case to the American people and tell them what is really the truth, is that 2012, the elections in 2012, may be our last chance to turn this thing around. We cannot keep spending at this level and keep taking more and more from the private sector, from the job producers in our country, bringing it here to Washington and spending it on wasteful programs fraught with fraud and duplication, and not even ever consider cutting any of them. Last week, Dr. Coburn had a couple of amendments to an appropriation bill that had some very small cuts that had been deemed wasteful, ineffective programs. On one of his amendments, he only got 13 votes. So this is clearly a bipartisan problem. We need to cut spending. Washington has a spending problem. It does not have a low tax problem. And it's time we focus our attention on reducing the size and scope of the federal government and to have it live within the constitutional boundaries. Eliminate programs that are wasteful, return others to the state, trim our budget to the point where we can pay for what we're spending so that we will not keep adding trillions and trillions of debt onto our country and our citizens and our next generation.